I recently found myself reading a book about the theology of homelessness. To be honest, it's a slightly boring academic book in many places in a rather unhelpful way. But for me, the book really sprang to life when the author started talking about some of the homeless people in the southwest of England whom he had met and whom he'd interviewed for the book. And amongst other people, the author talks about someone called Caroline. He says, Caroline begins her story at the age of 7. She recalls a dysfunctional family, divorced parents, her mother always out at the pub, and sexual abuse. And in the interview, Caroline says to the author, I didn't get on with my mum very well. When I was younger, I was sexually abused. I think maybe from the age of 7 years old, my head must have been messed up. Then Mum used to go out drinking. She started going out drinking all the time. She always used to come back and start on me, say it was my fault, and things were my fault, and my dad's divorce was my fault. She wished she'd had an abortion on me and things like that, which didn't make me very happy. The author goes on. At the age of 13, Caroline was shoplifting to buy food, and at 15, she left home and moved in with a friend. She admits she was hanging around with the wrong people, drinking, smoking, missing school, and feeling suicidal. After a number of unsuccessful relationships, she was married at 18, and her husband assaulted her badly. Again, in Caroline's own words, he beat me up, he broke my nose, and black eyes and bruises everywhere. And the interviewer goes on. Although she and her husband tried reconciliation, this too failed. She became addicted to Valium and attempted to kill herself. She was made homeless. She was evicted for non-payment of rent on the flat she was sharing with another boyfriend. And so the story goes on. And I think my initial reaction on reading that story was to say that in a way, that sort of experience of life is something which if I'm honest, is right outside my experience. Yes, of course, doing the job I do, I have met quite a number of people whose experience of life is not dissimilar to that. But I do have a strong sense that there is an enormous gap between that woman's experience of life and my own. And yet my understanding of Christian faith and the way that God sees the world tells me that that woman is my sister in Christ, somebody for whom Christ died, and, like me, a member of the human family. Tomorrow in church, we're going to celebrate Pentecost. Those of you who are down to read the lesson from Acts will, I'm sure, have been rehearsing, your Cretans and your Medes and your Parthians and your dwellers in Mesopotamia. But of course, the whole point of that story is that all those people are brought together by the Spirit of God into one family, into a single community from which nobody is excluded. And that leads me to wonder, what would need to happen for me to be able to say with a real degree of honesty and integrity that Caroline, that homeless woman, is indeed part of my community and my family? What would need to happen for me to be able to say that with a real degree of integrity? Historically, as we know, many, many churches have given generously and often sacrificially to show their concern for their brothers and sisters overseas. Christian Aid Week shows us again an immense outpouring and generosity of goodwill to people whose life experience is something which most of us cannot begin to imagine. But I'm left wondering why it is that we seem to find it harder to engage with poverty and different life experience closer to home than we do when it's overseas. And let me just be clear, I'm not at all wanting to bang the drum for the notion that poverty begins at home. There was some of you know there's a big debate about what that actually means. I'm simply wanting to reflect that we seem to find it harder to engage with poverty at home than we sometimes do with poverty overseas. And that's a bit strange in a way, because the poverty at home is quite a lot closer at hand. Now, the fact is that within our own diocese, in many deaneries, people whose life experiences are very, very different from one another are living absolutely cheek by jowl. In one deanery, we have two parishes who for a number of years have shared the same parish priest. In one parish, 15% of the children are living in poverty. In the other parish, 36% of the children are living in poverty, and double the number of pensioners living in poverty from the first parish. Out of the 232 parishes in our diocese, one of them is 41st out of 232, and the other 191. In another deanery, the discrepancy is even more striking. In two parishes which are absolutely next door to each other, one has 5% of children living in poverty, and the other 33%. These extraordinary differences in life experience are absolutely cheek by jowl within our own diocese, often within a few hundred yards of each other. And what that says to me is that within our diocese, there are real opportunities for our imagination and our understanding to be enlarged. There are real opportunities for us to discover what being part of the human family is really all about. And it seems to me that that is very clearly a Christian duty. We also have to acknowledge, if we're honest, that we have many congregations who simply do not represent the parishes that they seek to serve. And I don't mean that simply in terms of age profile, but again in terms of life experience. God's call to us in this situation, it seems to me, is that we need to find ways of putting ourselves into the shoes of other people. And as some of you in Darlington heard me say recently, the reason for that is that it seems to me that that is what God does in Jesus. God comes to earth in Jesus, and he puts himself into our shoes and starts to share and understand human experience. God has shared our human life, and he shows us in Jesus that God is indeed a God who puts himself into the shoes of other people. As a diocese, we take a very small step in that direction through our parish share. We know that there are something like perhaps just over 30 parishes in the diocese who, by their contribution to the parish share, enable there to be clergy in other parishes. And of course, as you'll know, I hope within the national church, we receive very, very generously indeed from other parts of the country. But my question, I think, really is, how far within our diocese do parishes who are supporting other parishes know and understand the life of the communities they're supporting? In other words, I suppose that leads me to pose the question, how do we start as a diocese to put ourselves into the shoes of others? I wonder what would happen, and this strikes me as a reasonably simple thing. I wonder what would happen if it was the duty of every PCC member, at least once a year, to walk prayerfully and thoughtfully around the whole of the parish. And to walk around, not at midnight, but to walk around perhaps on a sunny summer afternoon when people are out and about and doing whatever it is they do. I just wonder if PCC members were asked to walk around their parish prayerfully and observantly once a year, whether that might at least start to ask some questions of us. One of the places where we certainly do get insights into our community, and there'll be more about this later on, is of course through our local schools. And one of the things that I notice time and time again as I go into church schools across the diocese is that I'm just amazed by the deep understanding of and deep sympathy for the needs of the local community. And we need to look at how that understanding and sympathy within our local schools can start to permeate the life of our congregations. I wonder whether there are ways in which we could find possibilities for parishes whose experience of life is very different from others, getting to know other parish communities better and understanding a little more of each other's concerns. And in all of this, we need, by God's help, to learn to listen, and to listen in a way that is not immediately judgmental. There is, quite frankly, more than enough judgmental stuff going on in our nation at the moment. And what we desperately need within our communities are people who are willing to listen and to understand before they rush to judgment. Some of you will remember back to the days when Faith in the City first came out. And there were a number of sort of projects, things that I think in those days we call poverty hearings. And I vividly remember such an event in Coventry. And it started off in a simple way. And we were invited to try and work out how we would feed our families on the benefits that we would receive if we lived in some of our communities. And initially that didn't look too difficult. It didn't look too difficult until we realised that we didn't have enough money for bus fares to get to the supermarkets where the stuff was cheap. We then started to realise that because we didn't have bank accounts and because we didn't do direct debits, we were paying more for our electricity, at least they were paying more for their electricity than we were. They were paying more for their phones and so on. And we began, I think, just gently to put ourselves into the shoes of others. And then we began to understand how if you were living with that degree of stress and pressure and tension, it was kind of understanding that you would need to smoke a lot to calm your nerves. And we started to understand a bit more about how if life was like that, you might really want a good, decent television to while away the boring hours or to keep the children occupied. It was that very simple exercise which I think enabled us to start to stand in the shoes of other people. And I hope that perhaps later on in November, we may at a Synod meeting be able to do something a little bit in that direction, in a way that I know Newcastle are planning to do early in September. Of course, there is a need for challenge, and there's need for challenge in our lives. But often that challenge may need to be to us about our own ignorance of what is going on all around us. Jesus, of course, was absolutely willing to challenge, mainly, of course, the religious people, and we sometimes forget that. It seems to me that a society that rushes to judgment and dismisses members of its community is unlikely to be a healthy or Christ-like society. I was very struck, and I literally came across it on my way out as I was coming here this morning, by some things that Pope Francis was saying back in the days when he was a cardinal in Argentina. And he says, the poor must not be perpetually marginalized. We cannot accept the underlying idea that we who are doing well give something to those who are doing badly, but that they should stay that way, far away from us. This is not Christian. It's indispensable. It is indispensable that we integrate them into our community as soon as possible. And Pope Francis then, as a cardinal, goes on to say, a poor man must not be looked at with disgust. He must be looked at in the eyes. God's vision is a vision for a human family. And we as churches are invited in this part of our nation to discover what it's going to mean to be part of that human family where so many lives are so radically different from our own. I've always been very struck by something that Rowan Williams wrote a few years ago about Christian discipleship. He said this, and he talked about what Jesus did and the way that Jesus went around and was with all sorts and conditions of people. And Rowan says, being where Jesus is means finding yourself in the company of the people whose company Jesus seeks and keeps. So when Jesus goes to be in the company of the excluded, the wretched, the self-hating, the poor, the diseased, that's where you are going to find yourself, if you are going to be where Jesus is. If your discipleship is not simply going to be an intermittent way of being, that's where you are going to find yourself, in the same sort of human company that he is in. This is once again an important reminder that our discipleship is not about choosing our company beyond choosing the company that Jesus keeps. And Rowan goes on. So that is indeed why so many great disciples across the history of the Christian church, and indeed now, find themselves in the company of people they would never have imagined being with, had they not been seeking to be where Jesus is. I found myself yesterday lunchtime in conversation with some members of our Diocesan Mothers Union as they talked about their experience of being involved with food banks, being involved with credit unions. And the lovely thing was that I could see that they were indeed starting to find themselves in the company of people that they would never ever imagined of being with, had they not been seeking to be where Jesus is. And we do this initially at least, not because we want to make converts, but because we want to be in the company of Jesus, keeping the company that Jesus keeps, putting ourselves in the shoes of others, as Jesus did. So I simply offer that to you, as with the question as to whether indeed that might be something which we in this diocese ought to be thinking more about. Thank you.